This is Laurie Moore-Moore with Texas Brave and Strong, tidbits of Texas history you never learned in school. Today's episode is titled, The Comanche Terrorized Settlers, Leaving Death in Their Wake. The lords of the plains declared war on Texas settlers from the beginning. The challenge was how to combat them. Comanches. In the mid to late 1800s, the very word struck fear in the hearts and minds of Texas settlers living west of the Brazos River. Comanche were the lords of the plains. Homesteads, small settlements, travelers on the road were all subject to attack by the fierce Comanche. Cabins and fields were burned, men murdered, women raped and killed or taken to be used as slaves, babies and teenagers generally killed. Children under the age of 11 or 12 were taken, the girls to become slaves and the boys to be assimilated into the tribe and trained as Comanche warriors. The plains of Texas were a vast Comanche empire. Beginning in the 1700s in their homeland, what is today Wyoming, the tribe that became the Comanche had ranged south hunting buffalo, developing a large trade in horses, and protecting their claim on the southern plains by pushing out the French, the Spanish, the Lipan Apache, and continually raiding Mexico. Things that were key in making the Comanche so powerful were their unparalleled horsemanship and their fighting skills and strategies. Prior to Texas becoming a state in 1846, settling west of the Brazos River was an extremely high risk. In 1835, a permanent council of Texans authorized groups of 20 volunteer Minutemen to range across the plains and protect the frontier. In the absence of a permanent army, these frontier rangers represented the official protection of the Republic of Texas frontier. A span of land stretching more than 500 miles from the Red River to the Rio Grande and including an international boundary of more than 1,000 miles, reaching from El Paso to the Gulf of Mexico. When Texas became a state in 1846, the U.S. government assumed the responsibility of frontier protection. The U.S. Army established a line of forts stretching from the Red River to just northwest of San Antonio. 1,600 soldiers in 22 companies of the U.S. Army were sent to man the forts. The Comanche raids increased. Part of the problem was that 16 of the companies were infantry. They were simply not effective against the fast-moving Comanche on horseback. To complicate efforts, the Army lacked tracking skills, knowledge of the terrain, or an understanding of the Comanche's stealth-based hit-and-run guerrilla fighting technique, a technique vastly different from the European-inspired battle training of the U.S. Army. Unhappy with the poor results of the Army's passive patrol system, frontier settlers begged for the state to send them Texas Frontier Rangers for protection. But the state was plagued with a lack of financing, and the federal government was not willing to pay. Minute companies, or volunteer rangers, who served in their home counties for a period of 3 months, were called on to supplement the U.S. military. These men had to supply their own equipment, a good rifle or shotgun, a pistol, ammunition, a good horse, saddle and bridle. They were promised a payment by Texas at the same rate as mounted volunteers had been paid by the U.S. during the American-Mexican War. However, Texas's lack of funds meant many rangers often served without pay. By 1855, peaceful settled Indians from a variety of tribes relocated to one of 2 reservations in the state. The line of forts was pushed westward, and the 2nd United States Cavalry was assigned to Texas to take a more offensive, and they hoped more effective, approach to reducing Comanche depredations. Despite 3,600 soldiers, that was 1/4 of the entire U.S. Army, who were assigned to Texas, the level of protection was inadequate. The Texas legislature finally authorized Texas Governor Runnels to call 100 mounted ranger volunteers to supplement any rangers already in service and the Army. They were to serve for a period of 6 months. Should attacks not come under control, the governor could call out additional men to fight the hostile Indians. The man in charge of these rangers was John Salmon Ford, known as Rip Rest in Peace Ford. Check out an earlier podcast for more on Ford. After mustering his forces, rather than waiting for attacks and pursuing the attackers, Ford took an offensive strategy to the Comanche hunting grounds across the Red River north of the Texas border. Accompanied by 110 Indian volunteers, primarily Tonkawa, along with his 100 rangers, Ford attacked a Comanche camp, engaging an estimated 300 warriors. After 7 hours of fighting, 76 Comanche lay dead. Ranger casualties were 2 dead and 2 wounded. This fight established the fact that Texans would now pursue the Comanche outside the state. At the same time, the U.S. Army policy also changed to taking the fight to the marauding Comanche. This new approach was underlined by the Army's successful battle with 500 Comanche, who were led by Chief Buffalo Hump. Still, the Comanche remained persistent. Attacks continued. Public pressure forced the government to move the approximately 1,000 Indians in the 2 Texas reservations north to the official Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma. Shortly thereafter, Ford's Rangers' 6-month term of service expired. This left the frontier again dependent upon the Army and a few scattered local volunteer ranger groups. In December of 1859, Sam Houston again became governor and was authorized by the state legislature to raise up to 830 men in 10 companies of mounted frontier rangers to serve as frontier protection for a period of 1 year, with an option to re-enlist for another year. Unfortunately, insufficient funds were set aside by the lawmakers, and the number of rangers slid from 83 to 60 men in each company. To compensate, Houston instructed 23 frontier counties to each organize 15-man mounted volunteers. This move increased the force to 750 men charged with the responsibility of protecting the frontier. Houston, recognizing that in the 3 short months since he'd become governor, 51 settlers had been killed. He also appealed to the U.S. government to enter peace negotiations with the Comanche. The dark clouds of a coming civil war in 1861 changed the attempts at frontier protection. When Southern states, including Texas, left the Union and formed the Confederacy, federal troops in the Texas forts were evacuated from the state with their guns by way of the Gulf Coast. Supplies were left behind. Most troops were able to leave Texas before the war was formally declared. With the official start of the war, those still trying to get to the Gulf for evacuation were held as prisoners until prisoner exchange agreements were made later in the war. As the war began, frontier rangers took over the forts and frontier protection responsibilities as well. Negotiations between Texas and the Confederacy over control, payment, and the number of rangers needed initially ended with Henry McCulloch organizing a regiment authorized by the Confederacy and named the 1st Regiment Texas Mounted Rifles. In addition, John Salmon Rip Ford had the responsibility for creating a Texas Ranger Mounted Rifle Regiment for the state of Texas. The 2 new regiments were to control the ravaged West Texas plains where settlers were abandoning their homesteads in fear. The most active defense of the frontier during the war occurred along the northern edge of the Red River. Organized troops were frequently but temporarily supplemented by special Minutemen volunteers from the nearby counties and by the Choctaw and Chickasaw mounted rifles groups from across the Red River in Indian Territory. The lack of state funds, constant reorganizations, changing commanders, threats of Union invasion from across the Rio Grande, and Unionist sympathies in some northeast Texas counties all made maintaining a solid defense against Comanche difficult. In fact, one might even say chaotic. To further complicate matters, deserters, Unionists, and conscription dodgers from across the South fled to Texas. Many of these men were headed for Mexico and brought a crime wave of stealing and killing along with them. A new northern sub-district of Texas was formed in 1863, but its stated objectives were enforcing conscription laws and preventing Union incursion across the Red River into Texas. Frontier protection got short shrift. A battle with federal troops in Indian Territory resulted in the Union takeover of Fort Gibson. This further shifted attention and action away from frontier protection. The need to deal with at least 1,000 armed deserters hiding in northeast Texas in the brush was a subsequent distraction. The Comanche took advantage of the loss of focus on settler protection and went on a rampage, killing 8 people, wounding and capturing numerous others in just a few days. Frightened settlers continued to abandon the settlements. Raids grew in intensity and took a new turn. The Comanche began stealing cattle and trading them to Union contractors in New Mexico. One guess is that 10,000 stolen cattle were delivered to federal hands in 1863 and 1864. In 64, troops were redeployed to meet federal threats, leaving only a 2-company battalion on the frontier. Most of the redeployed men were not returned to frontier service. Instead, once again, the state created Texas Rangers to protect the populace. At the end of the Civil War, these state ranger groups continued to serve on the frontier. The war with the Yankees had ended, but the Comanche War was not yet over. It dragged on and on until the herds of buffalo, the keystone of the Comanche culture, were gone. This has been Laurie Moore-Moore with Texas Brave and Strong, the best little podcast in Texas. New episodes twice each month. Find Texas Brave and Strong on most major podcast sites and on my website, lauriemooremore.com. Be sure to check out my Texas historical novel, Gone to Dallas, The Storekeeper, 1856 to 1861. Thanks for listening. Y'all come back.